Fianna Fáil have been trying to persuade people that it doesn't matter how you deal with the banking crisis. In their version, the losses are the losses. That is simply not true. With the temporary nationalisation approach, there is no policy of deliberate overpayment, and the state stands to gain when the bank is sold again. But with the NAMA approach, the taxpayer assumes an unacceptable risk. The government knows all this. The issue has been debated in great detail in the media, old and new. The overwhelming majority of independent economists, of all political viewpoints and none, is that temporary nationalisation is a better option. Yet the government is choosing to push ahead with NAMA. It is impossible to avoid the conclusion that the government is deliberately choosing to place the interests of banks above the interests of the taxpayer. What we also see right through this legislation is a determination to preserve the status quo, to protect the toxic triangle of developers, bankers and bad government that got us into this mess in the first place. We saw it in the case of Anglo-Irish Bank, where the determination to avoid nationalisation led to the blanket guarantee and a subsequent nationalisation on the worst possible terms for the taxpayer. We see it in the determination that at all costs further nationalisation should be avoided, which is what is driving the determination to overpay for the bad loans. We see it in the refusal to shake up the boards of the banks, and we see it in the extraordinary powers that the government is assigning to itself in how NAMA will function. We should probably not be surprised that we're being asked to bail out the banks and property developers in this way. NAMA is simply another step in a long line of decisions that favoured property developers over many years. A recent study of the Irish housing sector by the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice provides a picture of how housing policy has developed under this government. They note, for example, that between the mid-1970s and the mid-1990s, the price of housing in Ireland broadly tracked the cost of building a house. After the mid-1990s, however, there was a surge in the price of housing which bore no relation to the cost of the relevant inputs. By 2007, house prices had risen by 4 times as much as building costs. The average price of a new house in Ireland increased by 344% between the mid-1990s and the peak of the bubble, rising from €73,000 to €323,000. In Dublin, there was a 408% increase over the same period. Average second-hand house prices increased by 441% and 499% in Dublin. Now, needless to say, wages were not increasing by the same amounts. In fact, if new house prices had tracked the increase in earnings, that price, average house price, €323,000 in 2007, would have been only €124,000. Of course, when an economy starts to boom, you can expect house prices to rise. But you might also expect that the government would do something about it. As long ago as 1999, the Labour Party was addressing that whole issue of housing policy in a comprehensive manner. In February 1999, the Labour Party established a commission under Professor P.J. Drudy of Trinity College to advise the party on a wide range of housing issues, including the crisis in affordability that was then facing young couples. That report explicitly identified a number of factors that were leading to escalating house prices, including the lax lending policies of the banks, the impact of speculation on the housing market, and the effect of property-based tax reliefs. The report made a series of recommendations covering a wide range of housing policy, but with a particular focus on affordability. Again and again over the past decade, Labour raised the question of spiralling house prices, and again we were ignored. In 2003, the Labour Party made a submission to the All-Party Committee on the Constitution, making it clear in our view that there was no constitutional impediment to the implementation of the Kenny proposals to control the price of building land. We followed that up with a bill to give effect to the Kenny formula, which was again rejected by the government. For its part, the government twisted and turned in every possible way to avoid confronting this issue. Certainly they commissioned reports and promised action, but that action either did not materialise or in some cases was reversed before it could have any impact. More and more, housing was treated as an instrument of speculation and accumulation rather than as a basic human need. If you ever want a more telling statistic about how Fianna Fáil has deserted its roots in the last 10 years, then you will find it in the figures on social housing. In the 1930s and 1940s, social housing amounted to 60 to 70% of all housing output. As late as 1985, the public sector was responsible for 27% of output. But in the boom years of 1995 to 2006, that fell to just 6%. Again and again, the Labour Party called for action, yet nothing was done. At the same time, Fianna Fáil blatantly flaunted their connections to property developers and speculators. Those lavish Fianna Fáil election campaigns, which took political spending in Ireland to new heights, had to be financed somehow. Fianna Fáil, frankly, didn't care how any of this looked, and it looks pretty shabby now. Meanwhile, all of this was having a damaging effect on our economy. As the construction bubble gained momentum, more and more labour and resources were sucked in and became dependent on the construction sector. By early 2007, more than 20% of all male employment was in construction. As a result, the competitiveness of the exporting economy was undermined. After 2000, Irish export performance began to flag. The export boom that Fianna Fáil inherited from the government that it took over from in 1997 petered out as the current account of the balance of payments turned negative. Of course, it is natural for any people who have gained new wealth to want to spend it. It is entirely normal to expect consumption and housing output to grow in the wake of an export boom. The purpose, however, of economic policy is not growth for its own sake, but to provide more employment and higher standards of living. But the people who were supposed to be in charge, the people whose duty it was to protect the economy, were at best asleep at the wheel. Fianna Fáil were in charge. It was they who were supposed to ask the right questions, to ensure that the banking system was properly regulated, to prevent the build-up of risk in the banking system, and you failed in that duty. If you want an example of how the system was asleep, look at Irish Nationwide. I know the main focus of attention today is on the large institutions, but you do have to ask the question as to how a small building society like Nationwide acquired a commercial loan book of €8 billion. How was that allowed to happen? The pity of it is that action of any kind at any stage would have at least lessened the impact of the banking crisis as it is being felt today. In a bubble of this kind, the worst excesses often happen just before the crash comes. This commitment to the bubble economy has also been in evidence throughout the handling of the banking crisis. Through every U-turn and policy switch, there has been a common theme: protect the banks and the bankers, avoid nationalisation. We now know, for example, that on the night of the blanket guarantee, 30th of September 2008, the Department of Finance had prepared a bill to nationalise Anglo-Irish Bank. Instead, the government put in place a guarantee for the whole banking system, including Anglo, which now represents 28 billion of the toxic debt that we have to take over. Anglo was kept alive for another 3 months, during which time significant bonuses were paid, and it was January before the inevitable happened. The structure of the guarantee was in itself inexplicable, since it covered parts of the bank's capital. It has never been properly explained why dated subordinated debt was covered by the guarantee. Bonds that are supposed to be available to absorb losses in certain circumstances were guaranteed by government. Why? No adequate explanation has ever been given. Nor have we seen concerted action to reform the banks. There have been some changes at senior management and at board level, but change has been little and slow. Last week, the Irish Times published a profile of the boards of the 6 covered institutions. There have been significant changes in Anglo and in Irish Nationwide at board level. But look at the boards of the other banks. Leaving aside the 2 public interest directors, 9 out of the 10 people on the board of AIB have been in place since before 2008. In Bank of Ireland, the figure is 10 out of 12. In EBS, 8 out of 11. And for Irish Life and Permanent, 6 out of 8. With all due respect to the individuals involved, those boards have failed. Yet the government has done little or nothing to remove them, when firm action in this respect would have cost them little, and yes, would have contributed to restoring confidence in the Irish economy and in Irish sovereign debt. And even now, with all we know, it is clear that the lessons have not been learned. The NAMA bill before the House is intended to protect the toxic triangle, not break it up. Worse than that, it will create an unhealthy alignment of interests for future governments to contend with. From now on, whether implicitly or explicitly, every government policy will have to be NAMA-proofed. Every measure proposed to be taken will be assessed on the criterion: what will this do to property prices and what impact will it have on NAMA? The state will have an enormous vested interest in restarting the property boom, in getting property prices back up as high as possible, and NAMA will, in that sense, have to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everything possible will be done to ensure that it succeeds. And if anyone doubts that this is so, look at the governance structures within NAMA as proposed in this bill. The bill vests extraordinary powers in the Minister for Finance and extraordinary discretion in deciding how NAMA will operate. There is a general statement in Section 9 that says that except where otherwise provided in this Act, NAMA is independent in the performance of its functions. However, there are many places where there are otherwise provided for so that it is not independent but must act at the direction of the Minister. And I believe that it is important that we identify these. In the long title, Section 65, it makes it clear that NAMA's function is to acquire certain assets from certain persons to be designated by the Minister. It is also to perform such other functions related to the management as are directed by the Minister. In Section 11, the Minister may confer on NAMA by order such additional functions connected with NAMA as he or she thinks fit. The designation of eligible bank assets to be purchased by NAMA is a power vested by Section 67 in the Minister for Finance. Section 13 of the bill requires NAMA in the performance of its functions to have regard to any guidelines issued by the Minister, and in Section 14 it sets down the Minister's powers of direction, whereby the Minister may give a direction in writing to NAMA concerning the achievement of the purpose of this Act. There is one area where ministerial discretion is particularly worrying, and that is where it is related to the determination of acquisition values. Again, it is important to list the specifics. In Section 676, the Minister may make regulations to require NAMA to take into account the report of an expert concerning factors or matters relevant to the determination of the value of a property in 7. Section 77, the Minister decides the adjustment factors to be taken into account in determining the long-term economic value of bank assets. Section 109, the Minister appoints an expert reviewer, and Section 116, he appoints the valuation panel, which in turn reviews the total portfolio acquisition value and then proceeds under Section 121 to communicate its position not to NAMA but to the Minister. Can the Minister indefinitely keep calling upon the valuation panel to reconsider unless and until it comes up with an answer that suits the Minister? In setting up NAMA, the Government has sought to vest it with some of the authority of the NTMA, and the Central Bank Governor is also mentioned in passing. Yes, it is very clear from reading the bill that NAMA will have very little real contact with the NTMA other than as a tenant. There are also extensive powers given to the Minister in dealing with the restructuring of banks after the loans have been transferred. Under Section 203, the regulatory authority may, but only with the approval of the Minister, give a direction to a participating institution in order to achieve the purposes of the bill. One has to ask where the Oireachtas itself would stand in such a situation and why these powers are being handed over to the Minister. This continues a trend established in the legislation underpinning the bank guarantee of extending extraordinary discretionary powers to a Minister, and in this case to a Minister from a party which created the problems in the first place. There are other legal problems with the bill, which the Labour Party has identified in its recently published critique. Some of these have been the subject of communication between my colleague Deputy Joan Burton and the Minister. There are also important features of the way in which NAMA will operate that are not mentioned in the bill. For example, it is proposed that NAMA will assume ownership of the loans, but that they will be managed by the banks that initiated them. Has the Minister considered the potential for conflicts of interest in this arrangement? How can a person who is an employee of a bank and whose career is in the bank be expected to navigate any conflicts that might arise? Will the banks that originated the loans be allowed to buy back those loans at market prices in a few years' time? There continue to be many uncertainties about how NAMA will operate in practice. Indeed, the second stage speech delivered by the Minister was replete with uncertainties. The figures which gain most prominence in the media are naturally the broad aggregates. These figures are described in the Minister's booklet in the following terms. They are, and I quote, top-down, illustrative estimates of aggregate loan purchase prices for illustrative purposes only. Numbers that are absolutely vital to the whole business are either heavily qualified or not included in the booklet at all. The much spoken of equity in the loans can only be imputed from an approximate average LTV. Is it there or isn't it? Of course we don't know, and we won't know until NAMA goes through the loans one by one. More importantly, we don't know the discount that will be applied in the end. The figure of 30% is an industry-wide estimate. If it were to turn out that this estimate were to be wrong, then the cost to the taxpayer will be high indeed. But of course, it is important to remember that the discount that will apply at the end of the process will be very different across the different banks. If it turns out that this 30% is accurate, but that figure is much higher in Anglo than in other banks, then again, the picture is different from the one that the government is trying to paint. Of course, it is fair for the government to say that they will not know the final figures until NAMA has done its work, though it is striking that a year after the banking guarantee, the estimates are still as shaky as they are. The cost of government borrowing has been profoundly affected by the uncertainties surrounding the banks. The slow pace at which this information has come out has contributed to that uncertainty. I want at this point to make a brief comment on the section in the Minister's speech where he purported to cost the Labour Party proposal. Frankly, it was pretty pathetic stuff. It was not worthy of him, and it was not an appropriate use, in my view, of civil service resources. But for the record, the Labour Party did not propose blanket nationalisation. In fact, what we have been suggesting is the temporary nationalisation of AIB and the Bank of Ireland. The Minister claims that Labour proposed a straight 50% write-down of bad loans. We made no such proposal. The Minister claims that under nationalisation, Labour would have to borrow at market rates of 4% to recapitalise the banks. There is no evidence to support that claim. The Minister claims that international markets would not lend to nationalised banks. There is no evidence to support this claim, and no one serious commentator accepts it. There are many state-owned banks around the world that have no difficulty in borrowing on the world markets. The Minister claims that Labour's proposal is based on an ideological preference for public ownership of the banks. Labour has repeatedly pointed out that we would sell the banks back to the private sector as quickly as possible. Labour's proposal is to nationalise where necessary and resell when possible. In fact, it is Fianna Fáil that are ideologically opposed to public ownership. They are going to extraordinary lengths to avoid public ownership, as they say, in the national interest. The argument about temporary nationalisation is well established and it is clear. It avoids the risks involved in the valuation of loans, and it gives the taxpayer the prospect of sharing in the benefits of a revived banking system, and the Minister knows it. There are a lot of comments being made these days that NAMA is the only show in town. The only show in town. T-O-S-I-T. Tosset. So I suppose its proponents might be called tossers. Well, you know, some of the tossers seem to me to have a season ticket with Fianna Fáil. There are other shows in town. There are alternatives to what the government is proposing. What the government is proposing will cost the Irish public too much into the future. It is built on assumptions in relation to market value and in relation to the way in which that market value might increase into the future that are very shaky indeed. It is based on estimates that we have still not seen spelled fully out, but are expressed only in the most general of terms. It is a risk. It is a gamble. It is a gamble that the Labour Party believes should not be taken. There is a better way, and that better way is the way that has been advocated by the Labour Party, which is the temporary nationalisation of the two big banks, the writing down and the cleaning up of their balance sheets, getting those banks lending again to business, and getting our economy moving again. It's not an easy way, it's not a cost-free way, but it is a way that involves less risk for the public, less risk for the taxpayer, and we believe is a more effective way of getting a functioning banking system again.